Hello everyone, I'm Deyasini and I welcome you all to the Stories of the Indian Diaspora series with reference to TMYS Reviews June 2021 project that invites stories on the Indian diaspora. This is basically to investigate the ambition-based movement under our annual theme of migration, displacement, resettlement. Today we are honored to present Professor Jaswinder Bolina. Professor Bolina is an American poet and associate professor at the University of Miami, where he currently teaches in the MFA program. He is the author of the chapbook The Tallest Building in America and a book of essays on color. His full-length poetry collections are Carry Away, which won the Colorado Prize from the Center of Literary Publishing, Colorado State University, Phantom Camera, which won the Green Rose Prize in Poetry from New Issues Poetry and Prose, and the 44th of July. His poems have been published on the Poetry Society of America's website. We welcome you, sir, and it must be 11 a.m. in your place, so a very good morning to you.
Thank you, and good evening to all of you.
Okay, so also we have Sanchaiyata Majumdar joining us in the session. She's currently working as an assistant professor of English at Karan City University, Bangalore. She completed her graduation from Beetham College, Kolkata in English literature and her post-graduation from the University of Calcutta. She has successfully completed her MPhil on rereading Marcus's Women, a study of selected characters from Ravindra Bharati University, Kolkata. With 6 eventful years in teaching, her areas of interest are Latin American literature, literary critical theories, postmodernism, business communication, and so on. She's an associate editor of the Dawn Journal and the editor in chief of the GCU World magazine. She's also presently the core committee of the Planning, Monitoring, Statistics, and Evaluation Board at Garden City University. We welcome you, Shanchoita, and
Thank you
I
so
would
much.
and I would now request you to kindly proceed with your questions.
Yeah, hi, Mr. Bolina. So I'll be questioning you first. So this is my first question to you, and this is based on your collection of poems, Phantom Camera, wherein while I was reading the poems, I came across the sense of nostalgia. So I would like to ask you, going by the relation of nostalgia with diaspora experiences and writings, for an American Indian origin, how would you relate nostalgia? Is this nostalgia your sense for your roots in India, back in India, or is this nostalgia for the growing up America and in comparison with the present America? So how would you relate this nostalgia in your poems?
Well, it's actually a very astute question because nostalgia is all over my work, I suppose, and the moment that you said that word, it triggers many thoughts for me. The definition that the informal definition that I like of a nostalgia is that it's a kind of a scratch that you can't itch. Like, if you have a spot on your back where there's an itch and you can't quite reach it, or somewhere else, but that's a metaphor for a kind of, I don't know, internal feeling that you can't quite reach the thing that you are wanting. And so I think in that sense, nostalgia can take many forms, the kind of personal, private nostalgia you have for members of your family who you perhaps don't see very often or who are gone, and for moments in your life that are, past that you wish you could somehow return to. And so, those are nostalgias that I suppose we all have, right? But for me, in terms of thinking of diaspora and thinking of a relation to India or my childhood here or my earlier years here, I think India is an interesting idea for me. It very much feels like the itch you can't scratch, because I've only been there once when I was 4 years old, and I have photographs, I have that my mother took a few, and my I have some memories, but I don't recall anything. And I very much wish to, but it's a difficult thing to express in poetry because you can't. I don't have any frame of reference. I don't have anything to describe, and so often, for me, the nostalgia takes place in a kind of imagined space that isn't quite a real memory, and it isn't quite a completely invented one either. So in that sense, I think that India is very much an imaginary place for me, and so I have this sort of affection for it, but I know nothing about it really.
So I'll move to my next question, and I have been curious about this thing about accent, be it natural or acquired. So I would like to know, what role does accent play in blending in or trying to fit in into a different culture?
I mean, it's such an odd thing, right? It's a quirk of the way that we speak, and it's completely meaningless, really. If a person has full apprehension and control of the language, accent shouldn't matter. And yet, in a country like this one, native speakers are often extremely judgmental and exclusionary towards people who have accents. Now, as you can tell from hearing me, I in this context, I don't really have an accent. In the U.S., I have a very standard Midwestern way of speaking, which is sort of Midwestern English is not quite so high-minded, but it's sort of like the Queen's English or Oxford English. It's sort of the standard English in the U.S. It's not heavily accented, but different kinds of accents do come out for me at times. I was born and raised in Chicago. There's a very specific regional kind of accent that will come out when I speak. But seeing my family, my parents and cousins and aunties and uncles who came and have that accent, it's the most arbitrary and kind of awful kind of barrier that gets put up. But it is undeniable that in the U.S. The majority culture is extremely judgmental and exclusionary based on something like accent. But for me personally, I have come to I just have so much affection for accents now. You were speaking of nostalgia and different accents, whether it's British or Indian or Canadian. I have so many family in all of these different places, or from these different places, that I personally love accents. I think they're wonderful, and they remind me of individuals and moments in my life in different places. But I would say, in terms of assimilation into the majority culture in the U.S., accent can very much be a kind of a hurdle that needs to be cleared. Though I wish it wouldn't. I wish people could simply speak the way they speak, and we would embrace and enjoy that speech.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Bolina. Deyasini, over to you.
Thank you, Sanchaiyata. Professor, your collection entitled 44th of July is about Americans that America didn't invite, the brown and the bland ones. And what I am reminded of, is a very famous image that was used by Walter Benjamin in his essay on translation. And he says that the pieces of a broken vessel do not do not fit together just because they are same, but they fit into each other in all their differences. So how much have you perceived yourself as being a misfit, and in what ways did this aspect influence your literary aesthetics?
Yeah, I it's funny to hear that question because on the one hand, I do feel at times like a misfit. There are certain expectations of Desi parents, of immigrant parents that I joke with my mother that eventually I did become a doctor, but not perhaps the kind that she had in mind. And beyond sort of career decisions, I also, as you would learn from my essay collection, I also married out of the culture, and and was not I was raised in the culture, in the language, in the food, but I also had a strong independent streak, and wanted to do what seemed natural to me, and so that sense of kind of failing expectation, it does strange things to you. On the one hand, you feel, well, I am successful and have done well, but I have made choices and decisions that might not meet the approval of the people I care about. And I think what that does in the work is you always have a certain sense of displacement or kind of alienation from both groups. The group, the majority group in the U.S. that you are being asked to assimilate into, but then also your immigrant family who has a very different cultural background and history. And so, that word misfit, it captures a lot of the sense. It feels like a somewhat innocent word too, that there isn't a malicious intent. Misfit isn't evil or bad and deliberately trying to go out and harm anyone. A misfit just sort of makes missteps based on your point of, or your frame of reference, and so because I grew up in a way that has multiple frames of reference, I feel I will always be a misfit in one way or another, but it does inform the work. I've come to embrace it in the work and kind of borrows from some of those experiences in my imagery, in my writing, and also one of the reasons I embrace it is so that if there are readers out there who are, regardless of age, but who share an experience with me, whether they're younger than me or older, they might find some recognition. They might learn that, just because I'm Desi and from this place, or, I'm an immigrant or I have this accent, there is somebody else out there who maybe engages in behaviors and thoughts and ideas that are, recognizable to me, because I think a lot of us are misfits. I don't think I'm the only one. And so I want to be sure I'm representing and, that perspective, so that others might, feel seen by it.
All right. Thank you, Professor. So moving on to my next question, with reference to the tallest building in America, what significance does punctuation hold in your life? How difficult it has been to merge the public and the personal with two consciousness at work intercepted by punctuation.
It's funny because the book that I'm working on now, it's a poetry collection. It'll be my fourth poetry collection, assuming somebody wants to publish it. It is called English as a Second Language and Other Poems. And in it, I've made a lot of very deliberate uses of white space and punctuation where, I've removed some of the words, so only the punctuation remains. So it's such a strange. It's almost like you were telepathic or psychic or something, and you have not seen this work. But this question about punctuation is very kind of timely in my life right now. And I think what punctuation comes to stand in for, it's a means of differentiating and creating, one's meaning, but also boundaries in language. And so. It's a strange feature because it's such a visual element of writing, and it's in that sense, punctuation is fundamentally different from the words, which are slippery, which can change and they mean different things and they can point in different directions. But the punctuation, it's almost like when you're driving down the road and they have the yellow lines painted to tell you, which your lane is and which somebody else's lane is. And so it forms a guide rail, and I very much in my poetry play with things like enjambment of the lines and certainly visual elements like punctuation, but also the grammatical aspect of punctuation. I think what it does is it takes what would be an otherwise flood of ideas and imagery and information, and it provides some structure. And in essence, that becomes a metaphor for, in part, I guess, one's identity when it's cross-cultural. You need to, whether wittingly or not, whether you willingly or deliberately or not, you're forced to find boundaries. Where does my one identity end and the other one begin? And where is there a comma instead of a period? Where is there a question mark instead of an exclamation mark? So I love the idea of punctuation as a kind of visual reminder of that space where the definitions are not very clear. The boundaries are kind of blurry.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much. Sanchaiyata, please take it ahead.
Thank you. So I'll take the very first line of your essay, Writing Like a White Guy, where the first line says, "My father says I should use a pseudonym." Now, hundreds of years ago, in the words of William Shakespeare, who obviously, being white, felt that what's in a name, but I'm sure we all do understand that there is so much still in a name. So, in fact, there's a growing trend amongst people to name their children with Western names. So, could you tell me how much does a name matter to exist in a foreign culture?
I mean, I will say that, from my own kind of juvenile experiences, I did, and others, I know many others from different cultural backgrounds, East Asian, South Asian, Latin American, different places all over the world, for whom all of us, our names were a kind of a sticking point, a sore spot, a source of difficulty, because the children around us didn't pronounce them correctly, or ridiculed or mocked them in some way. And so, I think for a long time as a child, I would wish that I had a different name. And, for a certain period in high school, I did attempt to Westernize my name, which is something that elder cousins of mine have done, and elder members of my family, just to keep things simple, often here to this day, if I meet somebody and I know I'm not going to encounter them or speak to them again, I might just say my name is Jay, like the letter, or I might say Jas, as my family calls me Jas, short for Jaswinder, but even Jas confuses Americans. It's so funny. The people who pronounce my name outside of India kind of most beautifully and most kind of truly are the French, who turn Jaswinder into Jaswinder, and I think that's perfect. I'm happy with that. But in the U.S., people butcher it. They see those letters together and they have no idea what to make of them, and that happens to a lot of us. But the one thing that I will say over time that I've kind of come to embrace and accept and realize is that our last name, my family's last name, is for the village in Punjab where we come from, Bolina, and so it's slightly been anglicized to Bolina, but that combination of Jaswinder Bolina, when I get Googled, there's not a single other Jaswinder Bolina on earth, so anybody who's rushing to kind of standardize their children's names, I would say maybe the thing to embrace would be individuality and uniqueness, as opposed to conformity and homogeneity. And my son, we sort of chose a name for him that blends sort of Sanskrit and strangely enough Gaelic. There was a name, Taran or Taran, depending on how you pronounce it, that has roots in Sanskrit and Gaelic, and my wife's family in part is from Ireland, so it was a perfect kind of thing to find. But my number one kind of motivational thinking on the name was to give him a unique name, and not to standardize, because yes, when you're young, you seek acceptance and you don't want to be too different. But as you get older, your individuality, your uniqueness, especially in our digital lives where things aren't Googleable and you can find people. It's having a kind of unique identity and a unique name has been a real blessing, honestly, especially in my life as a writer and as someone with a more public profile. So a name can be perceived of as an obstacle, but it can also be embraced as an opportunity.
Thank you so much. That was such a beautiful reply from your end. So I'll move to the next question. You have maintained that you prefer writing without so much self consciousness and that you would go by what Ezra Pound calls make it new. So, when we speak of diaspora experiences, do you think that each of the immigrant story will be different from each other? So, when we speak of diaspora in general, we tend to sometimes categorize them under certain, broader themes, and thus, according to you, is it time that we search? We miss out on the subjectivity sometimes completely because we kind of search for very obvious answers.
Mm-hmm.
So, what would be your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, my concern always with any, like, I don't want to be representative necessarily of anybody because nobody elected me. I just happen to share a background with somebody, but that doesn't mean I speak for them or represent them precisely. But I think there is an embrace, especially in the West among white culture. They want an easy way to parse and pigeonhole diasporic or minority experiences, right? So they want them. There's a lot has been written about the appearance of the mango in South Asian literature and writing, especially in the West. The way in which we exoticize and identify certain things with certain groups. But my own project in my own work is to provide as much of a differentiated individual kind of literature as is possible from me, and I want to do. I don't want to write something that resembles anybody else's story, and it's not so much because I'm so keen on ego and self that I'm so important. It's not that. It's that I have found when I read that the more specific a description, the more particular the writing about that one individual's life, the more, strangely enough, counterintuitively enough, the more I find to identify and empathize with, right? And if someone writes very generally and very broadly about, say, India or family or culture or food or whatever, I find less to hold on to. So I want specificity, and specificity almost by definition needs to be singular, individual, unique. And so, yeah, I am fully in favor of everybody writing their experience exclusively, and then allowing the magical relationship between reader and writer to work its magic for you to make the connection. Some of the novels that I have absolutely loved superficially would have nothing to do with me. I remember last year I read The Remains of the Day, Nobel Prize winning author of East Asian background, writing about a British butler in sort of post-World War I England. And I found it one of the most empathizable books I've ever read. I had so much that I could recognize in this British butler, which is really a credit to the writing and the willingness of the writing to be particular. It doesn't set out to say, I will represent minority experience. Instead, he writes this book about a majority figure. And in that figure, I, as a minority and as a child of immigrants, I find recognition. So I think we should all write what is in our hearts, but in our hearts only. Don't try to write what is in somebody else's heart.
Thank you so much. Deyasini, you will take over.
Yes. Yes. Hanifi Qureshi once said, the only way I could make sense of the confused worlds is to write. So, Professor, could you tell us how important art and expression is in settling the problematics of the dichotomous conception of home, identity, and recognition?
Yeah, I mean, for me, obviously, because of what I do and what I enjoy, it's been crucial, But the one reason that I think that it's crucial, and perhaps for others too, is because in the rest of our lives, when we are concerned about, finishing an education, getting a job, paying our bills, buying a house, getting married, all of these things, it is too easy. Life is too busy. It is so easy to neglect the time and space, that thinking about such issues deserves, because you wake up, your alarm goes off, you run, you take care of the kids, you go to, drop them off at school, you go to work, you do your job, you're in meetings, you do all these things. At the end of the day, you get home, eating dinner, bath time, everybody to bed. By the time that rush of activity is over, you realize you haven't spent a moment hardly thinking about, your place, not just in the world, but in existence itself, and art and literature give us that time, that respite, that moment when you walk into an art gallery, when you sit down in a movie theater and watch a really great film, or when you read a book. It gives your mind and your life that kind of pause. It's in many ways the only space where you get to consider such issues of culture and selfhood and your role in the world. And the last thing I would want, and I sadly I've seen this happen to people I have known, that the only time they ever consider these sort of deeper questions, larger questions, is when they encounter a crisis, a health crisis, a personal crisis, whatever it is. There, in that moment, they start to think about, what is my place? And they think about things like culture and assimilation. But most of the time, we're so caught up in the rigmarole of life that we don't pause to think. And I think art and literature give us a cause, a reason to think. And that's why I think they're so crucial. And I whether you are a writer or an artist or not, I think there is so much value in encountering those things.
Thank you so much, sir. Moving on to my next question. Having four acclaimed poetry collections to your credit, the themes ranging from the desperateness of the palimpsested circumstances to nostalgia, is there any recurrent theme that you keep returning to? And which poets and thinkers have been your biggest influences?
Yes, there are many things. I'm like, you all can't see. I actually have my computer angled just so you can see the books to my left. The book here behind me, you can see all the books. So yeah, obviously I teach, in an English department, books and reading and writing are a constant part of my day-to-day life. There are writers who I return to often, and it's by sheer coincidence because of something I was teaching. Some of those writers are on this desk right next to me, and so I'll hold up their books as I might. So I'll hold up. This is the Voice of Robert Desnos is there are multiple collections of his work, and Desnos was a poet of the French Surrealist movement, and I just I have a real kind of, maybe not for the political aims of surrealism, but for the kind of tools it devises. I find it his work to be wonderful. An American writer who kind of learns from the surrealists and later writes his own work that I love a lot is James Tate, who did win a Pulitzer Prize many years ago, in fact, for this book, his selected poems. James Tate has been a big influence on my work. A writer whose work, in fact, just got kind of reissued in a new selected edition is Lucille Clifton, and this is from Boa Editions. It's her selected poems. And I've read Lucille Clifton's work in many different places. This is the first kind of selected that I've seen, and it's and I just love her kind of plain spokenness and her perspective. For a lot of different reasons. I would say that maybe one of the books that I read earliest in my life as a writer that ended up really having a deep, deep influence on me is this one called Actual Air by David Berman. And it's an extraordinary book. He only published one book in his writing life. He also was a musician, which is very rare to find a musician who's also an excellent writer, but he had a band for many years called the Silver Jews, and it just brilliant, wonderful, sharp lyrics, but the writing is just so strange and wonderful. And he unfortunately passed away quite young a couple of years ago, but so he only published one book. But I read it, in 1997 or 98 when I was in college, and I didn't know such things were possible in poetry, and that's what kind of drew me in. But so those are just some of the books that are sitting directly in front of me. There are many others in many, at home and around my office. But yeah, I surround myself with books often.
Okay, thank you, Professor. I always feel that poetry itself is very hybrid, right? Considering the textures of its ambivalence and contradiction, and a singular moment that can mean multitudes all at once, unstarched, untethered, unbound. So I would like to know how this hybridity in poetry kept pace with the transformative hybridity of your sociocultural amalgamation.
Yeah, I mean, so the wonderful thing, and it's a wonderful question, and the thing that's so, I think, appealing to me about poetry is that it is language pushed to its limits, and when we consider language in the abstract, we realize that basically the entirety of our experience is composed of language, right? We think in language, we communicate in language, whether written or oral. And one thing that I began to believe many years ago was that the words we use not only are reflective of the things that we think, but that by expanding your vocabulary, expanding not just in one language, but perhaps in multiple languages, the words that are accessible to you, it has a dual reaction of changing the way that you think. So as much as words are a reflection of your thinking, the language can alter your thinking. And I think that has always been the most appealing thing to me about writing poetry, is it gives you permission to try to put words together in ways that they have never been put together before. That's really the fundamental aim of the poet, is to write the line, write the image, but more importantly, combine words that are perhaps familiar, maybe some unfamiliar, but combine them in ways that we have never seen. And those are the players that we celebrate, are the ones who that you instantly recognize and understand, but you've never seen it phrased that way before. And
absolutely.
And that, when you do that enough, when you encounter that enough, slowly your thinking changes. You begin to view things differently. And so I think, as somebody between cultures who has had to, reconcile a lot of contradictory impulses and ideas, poetry gives me the space to do that. Yeah, so I think that maybe that's my thought with that question.
Thank you so much, sir. Sanchaiyata, please take it ahead.
Yeah, so my last question from my side would be, like, it's more of an extension of what you had just told about poetry. So I'll just quickly quote one of your article called Power, Politics and Political Poems. that it's the poem that seeks first to disrupt the language and mind of the poet who writes it, to notice what has not been noticed already, to trouble every premise, every perception that can dare disturb the universe. So, my question is, if you were at all to choose between poetry and prose to talk about diaspora experiences, which one would you choose and why?
Well, and that's a big question, right? I think that I've had to, having just put out last year my first collection of essays, which I've been writing. It is very much a collection of essays. I didn't sit down and write that book all at once. It was multiple essays that I'd written in different places over many years, kind of brought together into a book. So clearly, I've dipped into the world of prose and nonfiction to think about diasporic experience, and of course there are books by others that I like quite a bit that are fiction also that do that. But for me, maybe the simplest answer is to say I've written 4 books of poems and only 1 book of essays. So maybe that has made the determination for me that if I had to go forward and I could only write one or the other, I would probably pick poetry.
Yeah, thank you so much. Deyasini, you can take it.
Yeah. So, Professor, this will be my last question. Is home a place or an idea permeated with feelings, emotions, and imaginaries? If you ask me, home for me is not so much about the physical solidity of the structure, but in the fluidity of remembering and the sensory evocations it brings. Uh, Home is where I am comforting, cooking, feeding people. So it is in me living and running as the fresh juices of the summer breeze. So where do you find a better home, Professor? Is it in the place or is it in the idea?
It's another, just both of you, wonderful questions. In some ways difficult questions, but very invitingly difficult. And it's funny because I have a lot of empathy with what you just said in terms of home. Home. I'll answer it in 2 ways. I will say that home cannot be a place because when we think of place, it's not. And this idea of home, it's not strictly geography. There's also location and time, right? It's sort of temporal location. So that building, that structure, that town, that village, that city, that country might be where it is, but it will never be. It may be where it is, but it will never be when it was. And so when you consider it that way, home is the one apartment we lived in Chicago, but then maybe it was the apartment after that apartment. Maybe it was the home we moved to. Maybe it was the home that we then moved to that my parents still live in, but that home has changed so much. And maybe it's my home now with my wife and my son. Home in that sense is in constant flux. So there, I would think the function of time and all of it makes it so any notion of home that is strictly geographic is completely lacking in something. One other element, and that's its temporal location. But on top of that, the more that I think about it, and in fact, based a little bit on the way, the lovely way you just phrased it, maybe if I could take it even more, a slightly more radical step than that, and say that home is, as far as I can tell, after 40 odd years on this earth, home is mostly right here, in this space, inside the body. It is the location of perception, of consciousness, and that until we die is basically right in here and nowhere else. And so anywhere from where you are looking out at the world, whether on a train or on an airplane or in your parents' home or your own, that space is the only one you can ever fully inhabit. It is the space inside your own mind. And I don't know what happens when we when we die and leave this earth, if you get to carry on in that perspective. I suspect not, because you're no longer in the body. But home may just be where your head is, or where your mind is, and I don't mean that strictly in terms of intellect. I mean that means all of it: your emotions, your memories, your physical sense of comfort or discomfort. And so maybe our aim should be in not thinking of home as a place, but in thinking of home as a moment, and even the moment we're in right now.
Okay. Thank you, sir, for answering it so beautifully. I mean, that was absolute poetry.
Thank you.
So, sir, thank you for your time and for sharing with us your wonderful insights. And with this, we end the conversation.
Well, my thanks to all of you and to anybody who watches this, and to everybody who organized it. I very much appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.